or so getting set up and letting people work their way back in with their coffees and teas. Please do return your cup when you're done to where you got it from, in terms of where the tea and coffee service is. Thank you again, Candace, for a really exceptional keynote that led us through so many incredible projects, and I know Candace didn't have a chance to talk about all of the work she curated for Documenta, but I encourage you to look some of that work up. Candace has a number of writings that are available online, and so you can dig a bit deeper into some of that work, especially if you're in some of the classes. Would be a good thing to have a look at some of that work. So now we have an artist panel with some of our artists in residence who've arrived early in July to join us. Really grateful that they can be here, and of course this program is really activated by many of the artists and writers and creative workers and performance practice folks, all our diverse practices, which combine to create, I think, a really important space for us to think further about Candace's prompt, for example, as art as knowledge making, or someone who I'm often interested in their theory and practice, Leanne Simpson, who talks about world making in terms of Indigenous resurgent art practice. And so I just wanted to let us know the format is the artists will each speak to, I'm going to read their biographies. Again, I want to make sure I list all of their accomplishments and works, and I like that bit of formality that acknowledges the incredible amount of work that they've done. Sometimes we don't always have a way to value artists' work and practice, and we need to think carefully about that when we're viewers or when we're consuming in some ways these practices, to acknowledge the labor in that. And so I'm going to read their biographies and invite them to speak a little bit about their practice, and then we will have a bit more of a conversation and invite Candace up to join us, and we'll also have a chance to take some of your questions. So I'm going to introduce you to my longtime friend and collaborator, my art brother, Peter Morin. Peter Morin is a Tahltan Nation artist, curator, and educator. Morin's practice-based research investigates the impact zones that occur when Indigenous culture-based practices and Western settler colonialism collide. This work is shaped by Tahltan Nation epistemological production and often takes on the form of performance art interventions. Morin's artistic work acknowledges that the creative process connected to the Indigenous object tells the story of our communities. In addition to his object and performance-based practice, Morin has curated exhibitions at the Museum of Anthropology, Western Front, Bill Reid Gallery, and Burnaby Art Gallery. In 2016, Morin was awarded the Hainatashin Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Visual Arts for a mid-career artist in Canada. And Peter Morin is an associate professor with the Faculty of Arts at the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto, Ontario. And Peter and I have also worked together for many years under different kinds of envelopes, umbrellas, hats, whatever you want to say, with Redwire Magazine, with Bush Gallery, and so Peter is a longtime collaborator and friend, and I want to invite you to share some of your work with us today. Peter, I'm going to put up your images.
Okay. Wow. Wow. I didn't. I've known Tanya for 20 years now. I didn't expect to feel so emotional when she was introducing me. And then all of a sudden you blink and 20 years have gone by. Like, wow, whoa. I think also as I've been reflecting on the past of my career and also the places that I want to go forward, I've spent a lot of time in my life considering deeply trauma and loss and grief, specifically around the intervention and aggressive campaigns of Canada towards Indigenous people, Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous knowledges. For me, the work becomes something through my body. We use the word performance art to consider how these things can become something in space And how I'm interested in how performance art also offers an opportunity for every single one of us in this room, for example, to consider that we actually have a body, you know? And how troubling that can be at times, and how complicated that can be at times, even without the intervention and the genocide that the government of Canada has been perpetrating and performing on Indigenous bodies in Canada for longer than 152 years. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about memory and the performance of memory, also cultural practice and production, how it is influenced and informed by memory, colonial memory versus or alongside of Tahltan Nation memory. I come to these territories today, and often I have had the privilege of walking on many territories, and I want to also acknowledge that I come to specifically now this territory to sit here with these wonderful folks and with you wonderful folks in the tradition of Indigenous artists, and how Indigenous artists have been traveling on the land, now known as Canada, for thousands and thousands of years. And the opportunity for artists to exchange knowledge and knowing contributes to the continuance and the continuum of Indigenous ways of being. It's artists who dream up ceremonies, it's artists who dream up new, systems of knowledge and knowing, which help the community proper to continue being alive. And so part of the work today was to consider going to international territories, I think, to be, how to be yourself on international territories. If I'm to, you have to tell me to stop talking.
Toby's gonna give you a hand signal.
Oh yeah? Just that? That 2 minutes.
But
I have 2 minutes right now. Great.
Is your mic on?
Is it on? Does it need to be closer? Okay, okay.
About 7.
So performance artist doesn't know how to use a microphone. That's great. That's really great. Awesome. Awesome. And it's being recorded. That's great too. That's great. Awesome.
Minute 30.
Minute 30. Shucks. And also, I don't usually sit down. Usually I walk around and stuff, but you know, maybe I could walk around. Yeah? Okay.
Just awkwardly.
Okay. Look, I could walk.
1 minute, Peter.
Ah! It seems silly to stand up. Okay. It's a big topic. It's a big topic, and part of the expansion of practice that I've had the privilege to experience is to travel on territories, international territories. So I wanted to just talk very quickly about 3 experiences that I've had, and to offer them to you, and then I'm going to just shut up so we can listen to these stronger people talk about their work. Collaboration is an important part of my practice, collaborating with Tanya Willard, for example, my sister. I also have the opportunity I have an ongoing collaboration with my best friend, Ayumi Goto. She's a Japanese-Canadian woman. And I want to offer this image from our recent exhibition, How Do You Carry the Land, curated by Tara Hogue, Métis curator Tara Hogue at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And so Ayumi and I, the part of the struggle is how to remove Canada from the conversation. And the act of decentering whiteness, and how the whiteness and Canada's white supremacy affect our ability to actually see each other and talk to each other. So Ayumi and I's ongoing collaboration in particular is very important to me, and it's a daily collaboration where we're asking the questions. It's not necessarily the performance itself, but in the creation and production and the living that informs the performance, we're asking the questions: how do I meet your ancestors? How do I honor your ancestors? And how do I how do I contribute to a space where our ancestors can work together? I think this might be some of the most important thinking I've ever had the privilege of being a part of. After 5 years of daily collaborations with my best friend Ayumi Goto, the questions evolved to how do I meet your mother, how do I honor your mother, and how do I contribute to a space for our mothers to meet. So in the middle of our Vancouver Art Gallery exhibition, we closed the exhibition for our mothers to meet. This also included Tara Hoag's mother, Marguerite Hoag. So Kyoko Goto, Janelle Morin, Azusa, her name is Azusa, and Marguerite Hoag met. And in the middle of this giant institution, we privileged and prioritized mother knowledges. Mother knowledges, in particular, which are often overlooked by institutions of these kinds. We set up stanchions and closed the whole damn thing off, and the sign said, "Exhibition is closed for the artists' mothers to meet." The start of the performance series for the exhibition, this one is called, what you're seeing is Assemblage Activation 1. And Ayumi and I wanted to invite the people present at the opening to join us in making a joyful noise, to invite all of the ancestors who felt harmed by the building itself. So the Vancouver Art Gallery, for folks who don't know, used to be a provincial courthouse. And so bodies of color, queer bodies, Indigenous bodies were criminalized in that space and harmed in that space. So we wanted to invite the people at our exhibition to make a joyful noise to let the ancestors who were harmed in that building or who never felt welcomed in that building, to let them know that they are welcome during our exhibition. Ayumi made 350 what they're called denten daiko. It's maybe you've seen these things before, but it's a little hand drum which has two little arms and two little beaters on it, and it makes a sound, den 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 den, yeah. And I made 100 hide rattles, yeah, and the rattles are red to represent salmon eggs. And in my collaboration and friendship with Ayumi Goto, she tells a story about her family owning a mushroom farm and sponsoring, her father and mother sponsoring new immigrants to come here to work on the farm, right? And I had thought often about how I would choose to meet those folks because Canada was ignoring those folks. And Canada often ignores folks. And I thought, I want to make something, because she's my best friend and I love her, for these families to recognize that they're on Indigenous territories. And so I made these rattles to, if I could travel back in time, to gift to these new families. Okay, so let's jump ahead, yeah. So I'm going to show you a video that really no one has seen. It's a cell phone video. I'm going to let it play 2 minutes. Okay, just show 1 minute.
No, we'll play.
Oh, it's only 1 minute long.
1 minute, 36 seconds.
And then I'll talk very, very quickly. Okay. Okay, very quickly. Okay, so I had the chance to go to northern Uganda to meet with Acholi people. Acholi people are Indigenous people. I was with a group of folks from the Lu Institute at UBC who, they're called, the academic space is called Memory Studies. And we were meeting with the folks there to talk about the history of violence that they encountered as a result of Idi Amin's government and the oppositional force called the Lord's Resistance Army. And if you folks don't know about this stuff, I'm not going to be able to tell you about it clearly enough in 1 minute. But the effect of this intensity of violence is very important to understand and to acknowledge. And so communities hosted us, and we traveled to massacre sites, and the communities of origin of those massacre sites offered us the story of their experience, and also made a generative, welcoming space for us. Okay, so very quickly, I'm singing a song. It's titled Surrounded by Cedar Song, composed by Kwakwakewak singer, songwriter, artist William Wasden, commissioned by myself and Sabrina Williams when we were working with Surrounded by Cedar Child and Family Services in Victoria, BC. We were working with Indigenous kids in care. We wanted a song that they could sing to let people know that they belonged. Acholi people in northern Uganda are experiencing, after the Lord's Resistance Army stole children, boys and girls, right? And then in the camps, the Lord's LRA raped the girls, and they have all these children from violence. And as a community, they're trying to figure out how to welcome the children back, but also the kids don't necessarily know who their father is, and sometimes their mother's passed away, so the kids don't really know who they are. And so we're there in Bucharo at a massacre site, but these are indigenous people, right? And so I'm still thinking through this, and I'm just offering this as a thought. Hopefully it does something for our conversation. But there was something about the indigenous systems there, and the indigenous systems that my mother and our community offered to me, which I think could speak to each other. And so I'm singing this song poorly, as a Tahltan body. It's a Kwakwakewak song, and this part of the song is a bird song. It's the song the bird sings at Alert Bay on the beach when the light emerges. So it's the bird song, you know. And I'm singing it under a mango tree after we experienced these indigenous folks speaking very clearly about the effect of violence, cruel violence, that they experienced at the hands of their government and the Lord's Resistance Army. And then I asked permission of the community. I said, I want to offer this song to you with your permission for the kids to come home. And then the women's sang with me. All of that comes to the body again, right? That the body is making and producing as much knowledge as it is offering rupture to systems of knowing and the effect of violence on Indigenous bodies. One of the main things that I learned while I was there was from the gift that Acholi people gave to me is that there's a protection in practice of culture. And maybe one day I'll write my PhD on that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Peter. Sorry, I'm kind of like hovering and going back and forth because I'm also putting on the images and also speaking to the artist biographies. So I want to introduce Audie Murray, who's going to speak about her work briefly, and we'll have a chance to be in conversation. Audie Murray is a multidisciplinary artist that works with various materials, including beadwork, textiles, repurposed objects, drawing, performance, and video. She's Métis from Regina, Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory. Murray currently creates and learns on the unceded territories of Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, Victoria, BC. She has completed a visual arts diploma at Camosun College in 2016 and her Bachelor of Fine Arts at the University of Regina in 2017. Her visual arts practice explores themes of reclamation, bodies, connection, duality, and the presence of medicine, healing, and growth. Her works have shown at various events and spaces in Canada, including Open Space in Victoria, BC, La Guilde in Montreal, Quebec, the Alberta Art Gallery, Edmonton, the Clay and Glass Gallery in Waterloo, Ontario, Hamilton Artists Incorporated in Ontario, and the Justina M. Barnicki Gallery in Toronto, Ontario. And maybe I met Audie first through our citation program in Winnipeg. Maybe I met before. Anyway, I really appreciated Audie's work, which I think encountered on Instagram. And really exceptional practice, and I was grateful to get to know a bit more about Audie's work through the earlier iteration of Citation, which was a program Peter Morin, myself, and Gabriel Hill worked with Plug-in Center for Contemporary Art in Winnipeg and brought together a number of artists, including Audie. So I'm going to pass it on to Audie and put up your images, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Hi everyone, Tansei. I want to say thank you to Tanya and everyone that's put in work to invite me here. I feel very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to speak about my work with so many lovely people. So I got here last night, and one of the first things I did was went for a walk and put some tobacco down because I realized that even though I have been invited here by people and institutions, I do want to thank the land and Mother Earth and reflect on the fact that I did take a plane to get here and thank the Mother Earth for allowing me to be here and pay my respects to that. I mention that because it is part of my practice, and it's part of these ideas and theories that I'm kind of thinking through right now, currently. So my name's Audie Murray, as Tanya mentioned. I grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory, and I lived a little bit in Saskatoon as well before I moved to Victoria, BC to study art. So I grew up quite urban, and a lot of my practice is centered around relearning different practices, different techniques that talk about my ancestry and how family members of mine would have worked before we lived so urbanized. And I realized the fact that not all Indigenous people live in urban areas, but very many of us do, and that reflects on how we live and how we understand and so on. So I'm Métis, and I have Cree ancestry as well as French and Scottish. Both my parents are Métis. My mom is from southern Saskatchewan, which is the LeBret area, Fort Capel area, and my father is from a little bit more north. It's more mid-province Saskatchewan, from an area called Meadow Lake. So when I go home, I go to Regina because that's where my parents live and a lot of my extended family, but I really feel like when I visit home, I'm visiting the communities in which my parents grew up in. So this is really important to me because when I go to LeBret, for example, I get to visit my aunties and my cookum and do things like have the opportunity to ask my grandma questions about her childhood, share some tea, and visit with both my family members, but also with the land, which I see very much as a part of my research as an artist, is visiting with the land, bringing the land food and sustenance and whatever I can, visiting bodies, and when I say bodies, I am encompassing like both our human bodies, but also bodies of water, and etc. So I'm mostly known right now for my beadwork interventions on found objects, but a lot of my art is multidisciplinary, so I'm interested in things like video and performance, although my performances are a lot more passive. I wouldn't say I'm a performance artist like Peter. So talking doesn't come like super natural to me, but that's all good. So I think I'm going to talk about the pieces on screen and go from there. So here, this is called half sun gloves, and so half sun is spelled S-U-N, or S-O-N, I'm sorry, and so that's what the Métis people were often referred to as in archaeological, or in researches that I've done and readings referring to Métis people, is that they're also referred to as being half sun, of course, because of the fact that they were seen as half Indigenous and half settler, and that's an idea that still comes up quite a bit in discussions in current days, and it's quite frustrating, and I think a lot of people do feel that way, like they're half of something or that they're parts of different things. And so with this, I wanted to talk about, just because you're coming from all these different family origins, I still see myself as like a whole being. So the flower motif that's on the gloves is like two halves, but of course together they make a whole, done in like a very floral, traditional floral beadwork style. And then the rest of it, the gray areas, are just strung beads, gray beads. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of the beadwork, archival beadwork, is like quite bright and beautiful, and I don't really see much gray in beadwork, but I do think that that color has its place in both art and beadwork, and it really reflects feelings, like how you can feel quite lost, especially in terms of speaking about identity and whatnot. So these gloves are a part of a series that I'm working on, an ongoing series. There's 2 gloves right now, and they're really, what I'm interested in is the idea of labor, and how that exists. So labor can be, of course, physical labor, that's very strenuous on our bodies, even labor of gardening, like these are gardening gloves, So the act of gardening is laborious, but then you get a garden at the end of it, and that's amazing because you can sustain yourselves and your family and your loved ones. And I'm also interested in the labor of beadwork. Of course, it's quite intensive. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of hours before, or my personal experience is that it took a lot of hours to bead, so I was comfortable enough to like show people my beadwork, because I think what we were talking about earlier in the keynotes about weaving and how weavers can like see other weavers work and like know how skilled that weaver is. It's the same with beadwork too. Yeah, so even things like getting your beads to lay flat takes hours and hours to do. So this is another piece. It's called For Hambone, Métis Billy Stick. And this piece is a gift and a collaboration with my mushroom. His nickname is Hambone because he's a ham, like he's like quite goofy, so that's why that's why I beaded a ham in the middle of the bag. I don't know if you can really see it. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it's a ham for Hambone, and so my grandpa passed away quite a few years ago, but he was just the kind of person that would make a lot of things that people just saw as like silly or like joking, and one of those things was this this thing called a Métis Billy Stick is what he called it. So it was just a found piece of wood, and then he wrote Métis Billy Stick on it and would give it to like family members to keep by your door. And so if an intruder came in, you could use your billy stick to protect yourself. And and I should also mention that a billy stick is another word for a police baton, and the word originates from like the 1800s London era. So it's something that police would use for violence and brutality, but in this situation it's not so much about violence but rather like protection and the act of love as like giving protection to other people. So this is not the original billy stick. What I did is I found a piece of wood and carved it down into a similar shape that he had to the billy stick that he had given to my mother. And then I rewrote Métis Billy Stick in his handwriting, and so that was very much the collaboration portion of it, and I wanted to create a sheath to go along with it. So the sheath that you can see beside the billy stick is made to hold the billy stick, and everything is done by hand on that piece. So all the beadwork, of course, the leather that I received to do the beadwork on was a trade for some tattoos I had done for a friend. The fringe leather is a hide that I tanned myself, the first hide that I tanned myself, and when I was putting it together, all of those stitches are done by hand as well. So again, this idea of labor is entrenched in this work, and it's really a labor of love in that one. And here, this is a roll of toilet paper. I'm sure everyone recognizes that. And so this is an intervention really on things that are in the house that everyone can sort of relate to, or brings an idea of, or brings comfort into our daily lives. And it was also something I wanted to do for myself as an artist, to test myself to see if I could really bead on something so difficult, I suppose. And it was definitely like a test of my patience. And yeah, so what I like about this piece is that it transforms the object so that you can't use it anymore for its intended purpose, but it also, through beating this toilet paper, questions like the idea of archivalness and so much beadwork, of course, in museums are archived to last for like hundreds and hundreds of years, and I guess this is kind of like a humorous way to talk about that archive because it will be quite difficult to archive this piece. And that's part of the work too. It's not meant to live very long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audie. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and thank you all for everything you've shared so far. I think it's really important to keep in mind this idea of labor that we've mentioned a few times, that people might have seen this meme for a little while, the art equals work one, and I think it's important if you are not a practicing artist to really think about the layers in these works, the layers of concept and practice and labor, in order to really think of them in an equivalent way as other kinds of knowledges you might be more accustomed to in your academic work. So I'm going to introduce Lindsay Nixon, who is with us. And again, thank you all artists for making this journey and coming and joining us. Lindsay Nixon is a Cree Métis Saulteaux curator, award-nominated editor, award-nominated writer, Shirk Doctoral Scholarship recipient, and McGill Art History PhD student. Nixon is a finalist for the prestigious 2019 Dane Ogilvie Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, and an Indigenous Voices Literary Award, and has been nominated for several national magazine awards. They currently hold the position of editor-at-large for Canadian Art, and previously edited, sorry Lindsay, should I ask you for pronunciation? Mamawi.
That's really great. Mamawi Atsawak.
Okay, Mamawi Akawak? Atsawak? Atsamawak?
Yeah, close.
Atsamawak. She'll tell you about it. An independent Indigenous art criticism, and literature journal. Their writing has appeared in The Walrus, Malahat Review, Room, Guts, Mice, Essay, or how do you say that one? Essay?
That's a good question.
Essay? The Inuit Art Quarterly. Sometimes you see these titles and you don't actually pronounce them. Inuit Art Quarterly, Teen Vogue, and other publications. Nixon's first book, Nidisanak?
Thank you.
Nidisanak, is out now through Metanim Press. Born and raised in the prairies, they currently live in unceded Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories. Cooksjam, thank you, Lindsay, for joining us. I'm going to come sit beside you now. There you go.
I feel a little bit shy or sheepish because I thought this was more of a panel discussion, so I feel very ill-prepared. So this might be a little bit disorganized. I was like rapidly writing out my thoughts, building off of everything that Audie and Peter said. I feel like I'm kind of an outlier for an internationalism panel just because I feel like I tend to work pretty close to home in my curatorial practice. But listening to Candace Hopkins' talk this morning and thinking about this idea of being a citizen of your nation and how actually it's not that different to come and work within Canada or go and work in Greece or go and work in another space. They're all sort of these neo-colonial nation states that we're working within and under. So that's interesting to think about. I'm also really bad at giving public talks. I'm working on it. I'm thinking about some mentors I have in the field who have taught me that being a curator or an art historian is a lot about giving public talks because that's how you honor the artists that you work with and do justice to their work. So I'm trying. You're probably most familiar, if you are familiar with my work, I don't assume anyone ever knows my work, but if you do know my work, it's probably as a public writer. So that's why I kind of like to give this preface that I am talking about my personal writing and my personal curatorial practice, but I don't want it to be seen as a reflection on anyone else's work. I think a lot about my work and working from my body, actually. This is why I love that you guys brought this up, because I think of my work more as about my subject position and what I can say as a queer, trans, Native person who grew up economically disadvantaged in a very specific context. What I can say about my experience of moving through galleries and using my own bodies as a location of, or a site of excavation of those experiences. I came into art kind of like in a roundabout way. I was very into creative activism in Montreal. I was very involved in the student strikes in the early 2000s. I met a lot of artists that way, a lot of Indigenous artists. And through those relationships with artists like Dana Danger in Montreal, I started wanting to write more in collaboration. And I liked this idea of the reading I was doing in Native Studies was so, not to like talk smack about Native Studies, but at the time that I was in Native Studies, I felt like it was so like, oh, I am the figure and I'm the authority on all these things that I'm speaking of. But how I saw this happening in community was much more collaboratively in meetings with each other and like generating ideas amongst each other. And I saw it being as much more of a collective knowledge that we were sharing amongst each other as Indigenous feminists in Montreal, creating this body of work at that time. And I liked that way of writing as writing with very strong kin behind you in the sheet, like the sheets as in the sheets of the page, that you're never really alone in your thoughts. You always have this community backing you because you're thinking alongside people in their work. And I think my writing practice came out of working in collaboration with artists like Dana Danger, and maybe seeing them struggle a little bit at the beginning of their career to have people understand their practice or understand why it was Indigenous, or even have it recognized within this larger canon maybe of Indigenous art. And so, without even like knowing sort of the struggles that they were facing in this institution that I wasn't a part of yet, wanting to do the freaks right and write about their work in the ways that they saw it, not in the ways that perhaps they were being objectified. I work really closely with my friend and writer Billy Ray Belcourt, and I think that we think a lot through this idea of world making, taking and making space, but particularly this idea of futurisms, not as any sort of depiction of Indigenous peoples in the future, but rather as more of an ethical and foundational concept for how you move in the world. And this is not queer as in a sexuality or a gender necessarily, it's more of an anti-identitarian project to kind of like make murky these lines of, that we kind of restrict ourselves to, and trying to think outside of the box of ways that we can meet in relational forms and form more ethical futures together through those spaces. I think about myself as a relational critic, like I said, just because, especially in that example that Candace Hopkins brought up this morning, because thinking about how criticism often becomes this space to project authority and pretension over other people's work, that sometimes there's missteps, and sometimes you don't even have the authority to speak to specific things. So when I talk about doing relational criticism, I think about this more as like trying to undo the spectatorship of criticism, and talking more about creative nonfiction practice, being a writer who works around art and around artists more so than writing with authority over art in any way. And I hope that no one ever looks at my text as like an authority on anything, because I feel like I'm just like a whiny teenager in my writing most of the time, still, at 32. Some of artists that I really love and respect and who I've worked closely with are Lacey Burning. Lacey will be here later in the semester. They have this really amazing project called Reflection Series, and it's just growing and growing. You can see their aesthetic just becoming so honed and so potent. Reflection Series was so emotional to witness Lacey go through photographing. That was taken in their home territories. I wish I had an image right now. And they went out there and they did a bunch of test shots of Lacey wearing this deconstructed mask made of mirrors, which is a very, the mask for them, it connects to this sort of like traditional knowledges that they have about masks in their community, but they want to make it new and ambiguous and queer and like gender fluid. And so it's like sort of this new world making thing that we've been talking about, especially in regards to gender and sexuality. And it was just so beautiful. They were sort of this phantom darting on the land, and it was very blurred, and these were just test shots. And then they went back to the same forest in their community to take these photos. I think it was 2 months later, and the forest that they had done the test shots in were destroyed by the industry in their communities. I think it's the logging industry. And so all they have left of this photographic work are the test shots, but they're still just so potent for the process that went into making them. An older artist who's been around for a long time and really paved the way for work like mine. There's a Cut Hand. Their video work is amazing. You should check it out. I was very lucky to do a retrospective of their work as a part of my exhibition Loner Culture at Inter-Access in Toronto. And it was so amazing just to go through their entire archive of work and just see, they've been doing such potent work for so long, and I think they really deserve props in the field. Another artist I'm really lucky to work closely with is Fallon Samard. They do these like trans boy sad memes that are just like so amazing and like potent, and really speaks to their experience as a community organizer in Toronto, working with Nishan and youth around foster care and sexual health. Yeah, and I guess lastly, I'm a reluctant academic. I'm doing my PhD at McGill. My research is mostly about this thing that I call new feminism, and it's just kind of building on this idea of ethical protocol as a way of relating, genderless, relational, and Indigenous way of relating. And so over the next year or so, I'm going to be doing a series of interviews that will then be made available publicly as a component of public engagement scholarship with a newer generation of artists who are identifying with tenets of feminism and queer feminism in their practice. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. So we have a little prompt. It's true that some of the organization of this panel is also who is able to join us at what time. But I think that something I picked up on, Candace, from your talk, and thinking about this space of the international, is thinking about thinking about my own background in terms of being of settler and Secwepemc ancestry, and this kind of obvious realization that in many cases we are very international bodies to begin with in many different ways. And I sort of just thought of that prompted by your talk, and I think that speaks to the power of this relational framework. In terms of your use of the term as a relational critic, and also thinking through your work, Audie, and how you offered kinship, relationality, and collaboration through that, and then Peter seeing the way that so quickly the song that you were sharing was collaborative, that people very quickly, or perhaps at least in the video, very quickly were responsive, again in this kind of call-response structure that you spoke to also, Candace, in terms of thinking about how works in your curatorial framework for Documenta spoke to each other, or spoke as ensembles, or what they sounded as ensembles. And so I think, though the idea of internationalism, maybe in terms of like experience with different international institutions or projects, is a specific scope, I wanted to sort of really widen it out and think through everything that everyone presented and offered within that. And so I did want to think through, when I was forming who was going to be here and Candace's topic and keynote, I was drawn to think about Leanne Simpson's work, as we have always done, and she discusses what she terms Anishinaabe internationalism, and she writes about this in that text. And we might also talk about this as Indigenous internationalism. She describes Anishinaabe grounded normativity, which she borrows this idea of grounded normativity, or maybe not borrows, but shares in a relational way with Glenn Sean Coulthard, as well as her work with Dashinta. So Anishinaabe grounded normativity provides the instigation for wide intellectual engagement, but centers it within place-based practices and knowledges. This quote's a little long, but I think it's important. This means we have to continually be knowing and expressing who we are as Indigenous peoples within grounded normativity, and assessing the usefulness of theories from other nations from the inside. And she goes on to say, I think grounded normativity in its Anishinaabewin formation, and excuse my Anishinaabe, I'm also only just learning Secwepemc, so in my Cree house, compels us to ask particular questions when we're engaging with theories from outside our own practices. Sorry, one sec, just before I say. So, She says, before I use work by writers, scholars, and artists outside the Anishinaabe Nation, and in my own writing and thinking, I ask myself the same series of questions. And I want everybody to pay attention to sort of these questions, and I think it may prompt some of our discussion. Where does this theory come from? What is the context? How is it generated? Who generated it? What was their relationship to community and the dominant power structures? What is my relationship to the theorist or their community or the context the theory was generated in? How is it useful within the context of my own people? Do we have a similar concept or theory? And can I use it in an ethical and appropriate way? And she, in quotations, parentheses, says my ethics and theirs. Given the colonial context within which scholarship and publishing take place, and that's a question. What are the implications of citation? Citation as in C-I-T-A-T-I-O-N, as opposed to citation, which we're engaging with here as site specificity, as site, S-I-T-E. And do I have consent to take this intellectual thought and labor from a community I am not part of? Does this engagement replicate anti-blackness, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, transphobia? This critical process, I think, is a process that many Indigenous academics already do naturally. Oh, thanks, Leanne. And the answers are not easy, nor will they be the same for everyone. And I thought, and I sort of keep on like kind of moving my chair so I can see you all, so maybe it's a bit more comfortable if we see each other. And Candace, maybe you can join us. And I'll slide forward. Loud chair noise. Yeah. And I wanted to sort of ask you if there is a response you had to that quotation. I found it interesting to think about when I was thinking about the practices and the art making that we're doing and curating in the international sphere, but also in this way she speaks to citation and speaks to other ways of making and theory. And we've all described kind of different sources of knowledge and different sources of citation and different frameworks like relationality. Relationality is a really important principle to Secwepemc thought, and I think I can say broadly to interior Salish thought, and we frame a lot of our work culturally and politically on relationality. So I might just pass along the mic and we can all have a few comments, and then we will also open up to your questions. So thank you all. I'll stand up. I'll stand up and I'll look at you in the eyes. or behind you, and I'll sneak the mic through.
Here, I can pass it. Okay.
Or talk more about your song.
More about the song. I was thinking about invisible labor. I think that's an important part of the conversation, and how do we acknowledge it? How do we benefit from it, right? And so when Ayumi is telling me stories about her early childhood on this farm, she's also talking about the invisible labor that folks who came to the farm offered to Canada, right? Nobody thinks about the amount of work it takes to pick the mushrooms. We just access it and take it, you know? So her work with the Dendendaiko in particular was offering an acknowledgement of the invisible labor. So all of those Dendendaiko, of course, are handmade and harvested. She found the materials on the streets of Toronto and made them. But then also the Dendendaiko in particular, when you are leaving your country of origin and you have one suitcase and you need one thing, if you're allowed to have one thing to bring with you, what do you bring? Right? And so often that Dendendaiko, it's in the suitcase, right? And so that sort of culture comes to this place. That sort of like remembrance comes to this place, now known as Canada. But I think in particular, I'm very interested in, and I've always been thinking through, or trying to embody this, like how the idea of nation is like a cloud. a foggy cloud which covers up so many people's eyes, right? And currently, Indigenous folks or Indigenous communities, like, so much has changed, right? So the idea of nation is less about survivance, maybe. So I'm just offering these as ideas. I'm just thinking through. But I always thought, with my work with Ayumi in particular, but how indigeneity meets the world first. I've always thought that and always tried to privilege and prioritize that. And as we go forward, we have so many more examples of how that's actually the truth. In Canada, settler colonialism came later. Hot tomato, hot potato.
Say one sentence and then ride it with the complete thought, yeah.
We're not the typical panel.
Yeah.
No mic hogs. I was thinking about your question. Tanya had sent this quote from Leanne in advance, and one of the things that I was thinking about is this idea of, what, for me this is a question. What does it mean to be centered in place? What does it mean to know your context, the community that you're a part of? And I bring them up because we're just speaking personally. I was born in Whitehorse, and then when I was pretty young, my dad was the long-haul truck driver between northern BC and the Yukon. That's how he met my mom. My dad's family were immigrants from Wales who first went to Hamilton, Ontario, and then found the cheapest land that they could, and that was at mile 73.5 of the Alaska Highway. So we moved from the Yukon to the side of a highway, where the community really there is, and the teachings are from that place. But there's not necessarily anyone there to teach you about them. So a lot of it is you learning about where you're from, but then also you're learning from the practices that my grandmother was bringing from her time. The only way that they were able to survive for a period between when she was 8 and 12 is because she ran a trap line for the family because her mom was absent and her dad was dead, and she did that as a way to feed the family, but also to sell fur. And I always thought it was rather extraordinary because she was just under 5 feet tall, and she was even smaller then, and how she handled these dogs, which are pretty big, and then also settled the snares, and at one time even knew how to snare a moose. And those are the kinds of ideas that I think inform my place and my idea of community, but they're parts of fragments. She went to residential school, so she didn't have her language much past when she was a young person, and then for a very long time she had a Cree boyfriend, so she knew more Cree. This is the way things happen. But I often push back at this idea of that might imply what a fixed idea of place or community is, because I feel like sometimes that can also be alienating. So I like to think of an expansive idea of community, or one that has been coming forward. I think definitely in your work, and Lindsay, you're calling your practice relational criticism. And what is the potential in space and relationality, especially from those of us who have experienced these waves of, you could call them displacements, or you could think of the creation of new homes. So I wanted to put that out there, to think of place as very expansive, and to also find the potential in what some people might think of as a lack, and that is the fragments of language or the fragments of the practice, and how those very much are a real way of being too.
I found myself thinking of these questions and trying to reflect on how I answer these questions in my practice, and I think very much I do in a very intuitive sense, and what I mean by that is I don't always have the answer, but I feel I go about by the way of feel, But I also want to acknowledge that that I don't always have the answer, and then that is kind of a reality of the communities that I come from right now. So growing up in the prairies and then moving out to these territories, there is a lot more culture at the time that I moved, a lot more culture being shared, like within communities, so things like singing songs and like knowing ceremonies and things like that. It was hard for me because I was like, that's not the reality of how I grew up, and that does shift and it does change, and but it's still there and it's still prevalent. So I guess when I'm making my artwork, that's how I answer a lot of those questions. I think those questions come up and I don't always have the answer, and then I start working through a piece, and it generates these conversations, and it generates these like movements and these ways of working, and in that way I'm able to better understand where the work is coming from in that way too.
Thank you. I feel like what Candace and Audie said really made me think about this a lot. I feel like I'm very like nervous to like dip my toe into like international art politics or curation or criticism, and I often wondered why that is, and why I do work so close from home, and I see so many badasses doing such cool work on the international scene, and I'm like, you're so cool, how do I, like, why am I not into that? And then I'm like thinking about exactly what Candace said about this idea of who comes from a nation, and Audie and I having grown up in Regina specifically, which is a very urban context, but it's like an urban nation of its own too. It's like this totally other kind of niche experience than maybe, so I'm registered to my dad's nation, which is Tutunawaziing Nation, and my mom is Métis from Prince Albert, and my grandma had to leave Tutunawaziing Nation because the culture there was so violent towards women, especially unmarried women, and now we can only really go back in groups because we risk violence. And I know it's sometimes these things, when you say them out loud, it's like the men or like the band bros will be like, you can't say that loud because then you're selling us out or whatever. But then it's also like, but you make such a violent culture, like how do we have to be able to talk about it with each other. So when I think about nationalism, I think about those men in my community and like what they made our nation. And when I think about what pushed us into the cities, and then I also think about who I make work for too. Like I think I make work for queer and trans people who are still in like inner city Regina or inner city Saskatoon, because they also probably don't see themselves as part of a nation, but also that's not like okay. Like it's like there's the suicide rate there is so high because there's not a positive Indigenous identity still. So I think it's so complex, and yeah.
Thank you. These are all such important offerings. I think of textual offerings, and I think of our ideas as offerings in different ways. Because it gives them a lot of value that I think when we talk about invisible labor and we talk about ways we may be or maybe not connected to a sense of community, whether that's urban, whether it's on the reserve, or whether it's rural. And for me, some of my work has been about thinking through value and thinking through how can work that's close to home be as valued within the context and conversation of contemporary art as it is, say, in what we think of as the centers of contemporary art in terms of New York or Paris, or how can the site of the reservation, which is like the product of a particular history, a particular colonial history and a continued legacy of that colonialism in terms of the boundaries of the reservation. How can that space speak to this? What kind of internationalism is the reserve, which was, for all intents and purposes, has a different government, has a different legal land description, and so we have internationalism is not the right word, but we have these borders, I suppose, that we're constantly sort of borders and binaries that we're constantly sort of navigating in the work. And there's so many layers and so much depth to everything that was shared here today, and that's why I wanted to maybe call them offerings. I mean, We briefly touched on this incredible work in Uganda, Peter with the Lindsay, the space of thinking through queer indigeneity and trans indigeneity and speaking to that in a critical framework and speaking to those practices and making space. Audie's work, which so sensitively takes us through making as knowledge and relationality in your making, and Candace's, incredible curatorial practice within thinking through these issues through an artist's work, but then placing them in this other context and thinking through what we might think and see in terms of the practice, and then what other audiences bring to that. Sometimes, I'm sure there's also hopefully some also good examples of what audiences brought as well. I think, and that relationality, extends and ripples out further and further. And so with that, I want to make a little bit of space here for questions from you folks who are joining us. And maybe I'll ask, if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you this microphone. Or I'm going to stare at each one of you until somebody wants to.
Whoa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In terms of the relationality and its tensions or difficulties, I think of a discussion that Daniel Heath Justice has in Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, where he talks about the call to all my relations, and he quotes from Thomas King in the introduction to his collection of Canadian native fiction, I believe is the term that was used then, where he talks about to say someone has no relations as a kind of a very grave, almost negative sort of statement. But then later he also quotes from an essay by Wendy Rose, Neon Scars, where she says people talk about Native people, Indigenous people who don't have any relations. Well, I don't have any relations because my family threw me out. I'm paraphrasing, but she does talk about it in those kind of terms. And I wonder if the relationality also has to have some kind of a tension with non-relationality as a positive thing, in the sense that you're talking, Lindsay, about building communities in the inner city. I went to high school in Regina a long time ago.
What high school?
But Martin Collegiate. And talk about bros, a football and wrestling kind of school. But at any rate, but forming those communities that are post-national or non-national in terms of colonially constituted in a colonial kind of way. So I guess in terms of the relation, I'm trying to point to, but also ask if there's something positive that we can think about moving between relationality and what relations are and what they also can't account for. I don't know if that's really a question.
Yes, sir.
You got it.
Good citations. Oh, that's so interesting. I feel like that's not my experiences of Daniel's writing at all, like any sort of anti-relationality, because Daniel and his writing is so about, like, Cherokee people are so about, like, their relational system and, like, organizing. And so I should also say that when I talk about relationality, it comes from a very specific context. I'm talking about a Cree, Anishinaabe, Métis concept that is related to Wakotawin and kinship. And if I look to my teachings, I have to say, no, I don't think anti-relationality is possible, because I think that the goal to be in a harmonious life with everything is to understand that you are co-related to everything around you, and it's actually like a responsibility that you have to, like, call yourself to. But I do understand what you're saying about people who grew up disconnected and what it feels like to be, because like my family being caught up in foster care, 60 scoop, things where people are alienated from culture and they don't feel that connectedness. I think that, I'm going to cite another literary scholar too though, Eden Robinson, who wrote The Trickster Drift, and how like, I don't know how to talk about it because it feels so taboo and you're not supposed to talk about like Indian woo-woo, but there's like this thing about being Native. But there's just something about being Native in the world and like having, like looking back at my life before I was able to reconnect with my family's knowledges for my family in this very specific way where I can look back and be like, oh, there was this moment that I shared with an animal that I had and that now I know that that is this thing that I embody inherently and that can't really be described through colonial language. It just exists and is in connection with all being.
I think we've already been talking about a lot of this, but it reminded me a lot of the writing that I'm doing now is about really trying to understand the roots of what capitalist culture has done to ours, in part because I think that it's very much based on rupturing those ideas of relationality. It's based on turning things into commodities, which takes away, many of our current society's understanding of how we can be in relation with them. Like the one thing that I've started doing or trying to do is to imagine what the world was like for my grandmother's grandmother, who partially raised her, because my grandmother's grandmother came from Klekwan. She was one of the peoples who migrated across the mountain from a village that is now part of Alaska to fortify trading relations with interior Tagish people in order to have more effective trading relations with the Russians initially, and then when a lot of fur-bearing animals were decimated because of over-hunting, we stayed. But when we stayed, Tagish people, and some I think feel, in a way, this relationship happened over time, but also was a kind of neo-colonial relationship between Tlingit as well, where Tagish people adopted Tlingit clan systems and languages and customs. And so I think a lot of times when we think about this idea of internationalism or nationalisms, these are not kind of new geopolitical terms. They're in fact really, really old ones. So I'm thinking about those early relations, but also the things that divorce us from the places where we need to have the most healthy relationships, and that's with land, and also with water, because I think that this kind of mindset is a kind of sickness, and a lot of times when there's early writings or early experiences of recollections of the gold rush from people, from Native people in my community, they talk about how when people came over, when the first non-Native people came over, they were already infected. And they also talk about how there were then all these prophecies about how the world was turning white. And that world didn't necessarily mean a human-centered world, it meant everything was turning white. And they described first the fish, and then the trees and the birds, and we can understand white as a kind of metaphor for race, but really the way I understand white within that context was the emptying of everything that made life and made those kind of connections to life. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent.
Well, I just thinking about what you both were saying, and thinking about how easy time is, and how time becomes a sort of like it's like it's an intro thing, right? And that sort of like timeline thing that is so promoted and inundated and oppressive to any alternative ways of knowing. Did you hear what I just said there? Weird. To any ways of knowing which exist outside of Western European history. But like what you're talking about, Candace, is like the conception of time also informs the ability to articulate and practice relations, right? And so like that Western European time is very simplistic, actually. And then also how perhaps maybe how capitalism informs that dominant Western European timeline and reinforces it. I think it's really fascinating and terrifying. Yeah. Just thinking about how. Oh yeah.
You were just thinking about it. I was going to continue.
I'll get back to
it. I just maybe as a response to your question, and similar to what Lindsay offered, I think of that relationality actually as that. I guess in terms of what you're saying in terms of a non-relationality and that rupture, though I think when we talk, and maybe this is speaking to being more specific about ideas of relationality. So when I talk about relationality, I think about Kwaselk Danaus, which is a way of saying we're all related, but it also sort of compels us and our families and responsibilities to know that, to carry that, because it is also the basis of governance and of international and what Jeanette Armstrong, scholar calls interterritorial governance, so that we see the Indigenous nations throughout this area, down the Columbia, that many people have relations on the other side of the border, communities that are part of their communities that were bisected by that colonial border. And deeply our governance and culture systems were based on that concept of relationality, and relationality not just with our families, and this is, Ron Ignace talks about this in his PhD thesis, where he uses ideas of Soqamak stories, in some of his theorizing, and that relationality is so deeply embedded in our practices, and it actually, to speak more of it and to think of it and to practice it in resurgent ways is actually directly, like Candace was mentioning, directly sort of in conflict or in challenge to capitalist systems and colonial systems that have been introduced. It was directly targeted as a way to disrupt our governance, so that our court systems, our justice systems were impacted by non-relationality. I know that's like broader than your question or what you mean, and so it's important as a concept for me because it speaks to also different times, so that we're simultaneously in relationship with ancestors from the past, but we're also in the future. It broaches all of that as well as the non-human. So in my understanding of Kwaselk Danaus, it extends to very importantly, in terms of a healthy relationship with the land around us, it extends very deeply to our relationality to animals, to birds, to waters, to insects. It's that networked. And sometimes I like to think of analogies, and I was saying I was a nature nerd the other day, but anyway, of mycorrhizal systems, right? Mycorrhizal fungi systems, which actually are a deep embedded network of natural systems in forest floors. And I think like that's what we're talking, that's what I'm sort of thinking about when I think about relationality, that that networked and that deep. And so I think that that maybe non-relationality is a step in getting to understand deep relationality, like that finding it is important, or finding it, or also offering it and extending it to folks. And sometimes we're in the space of inviting people into communities who might be displaced from those communities within our own families. So certainly 60 Scoop impacted communities, I'm sure, here, and especially in Soqamak Uluk and Splachin. I'm thinking of recent work, Aaron Leon, who's here, shot, in terms of those ruptures. Other questions?
You gotta stare at them again.
Eyes.
All stare.
conversations here, so I encourage you, if you have a question, to share it. Or, sorry, also you can comment, because also we may not answer your question. We don't have all the answers up here. This labor of answering on panels is a harsh one too sometimes. Or we can also ask questions of each other.
I'm still thinking about this idea of relationality, and Audie, I wanted to also not lose sight of the fact that it's very much what I was seeing as part of your work when you're taking something that people might think of as a ordinary everyday object, or one that has been made into like a kind of family in-joke in the case of the club. But the toilet paper as well, like the labor of it, also the kind of material relations that you've created between beadwork and something that we throw in the garbage changes how we see that original thing. So I think that this is a really powerful example of what relationality does. So I really appreciated that in your work.
Clearly. Just hearing you even in conversation with each other is, I don't know, okay it is really wonderful. You know, Tanya, you and I have talked about this idea of citations, and I'm coming at it from the CITE because much of what I hope to do in my futuring of thinking about an academic the way I come to academia is to think about the politics of citation, and you're doing this on different levels with the SITE. And you know, it was really wonderful to put these different, the C and the S together, because it's not often something I see in a lot of the readings that I do. Like particularly, I'm very fond of Sarah Ahmed's work on thinking about a politics of citation for her own practice of what good practice is for her. And something I know when I was doing my PhD, sorry this is long, but I do want to hear more. You know, there's always to be, and this is changing as, you know, what theory is and what that looks like and who that looks like, and often it didn't look like me. And to see that increasingly it is becoming looking like different kinds of people, I think is kind of exciting, and something that continues to be something I struggle with in trying to work through. So I'm curious in the different ways you come to citation, whether it's CITE or SITE. I just maybe you could reflect on some of that. Anyone who wants to take that. Thank you. I don't know if it's important questions.
Yeah, I have a quick response, because I'm thinking of this, looking at other people here, and I want to cite your other knowledges, you know, those who are here as students in some of the classes that are running, as members of Secwepemc and Seal communities, Indigenous communities around us that I recognize. We're up here sharing this, but there are many knowledges here, and I think yeah, I'm interested in this idea of site and place-based, not as a border, but as something that is a form of also thinking through how resources and infrastructure and institutions have been distributed according to Canadian cultural policy, which, you know, spoke very derogatory of Indigenous art practices as vanishing, as part of the idea of vanishing race and that paradigm. And so it is a layered politics of citation that also includes thinking about impacts on land, and specifically reservation systems, and specifically British Columbia's history as encompassing many different Indigenous nations where we don't have treaty and we are unceded lands, and that are previous sort of interterritorial and internation practices, maybe not international, but internation, were based on that kind of relationality. And that relationality also is a different system of citation. So I mentioned Ron Ignace, he's Cookpee chief of Skitchison Band, and I mentioned him because he talks about in his thesis, when he's also discussing Kwaselk Danaus, our Soqamuk language that speaks to relationality, he speaks of oral footnoting, so that often if people are sharing songs and that song has come from somewhere else, like Peter did, he let us know that was a Kwakwakiwak song from William Wasden Jr. And by citing that, and that was a citation, right? By citing that ownership, you acknowledge that community, you acknowledge that song, that knowledge that comes from that song, and it sometimes is also connected very specifically to a place, to an Indigenous territory, that then we think through those layers of impacts.
Citation is very important to my practice. My whole book, there's like, I think at the end there's like 20, but just shy of 20 pages of citations from the chapters, ranging from like Notorious B.I.G. to like Gerald Wisner. And I think that, thank you for bringing Ahmed into this, because Ahmed was honestly one of my first feminist teachers about the feminist practice of citation and cyclical influence, and how authority, the need to be the only or the one anything, is capitalism, and white supremacy. And so decentering that and acknowledging influence. And I also have to thank Indigenous artists and Indigenous art infrastructure for teaching me visual citation, what that means, and citing the peoples who came before me. And I also think that citation is just a very Cree practice. It like really relates to Cree teachings, and I'm having a hard time like explaining why in English, but like there's just something about, I don't know, yeah, like the relationships you keep or visiting and like knowledge of other peoples that is very like citational. I like how you described it as relational citation. I've never thought of that before. Yeah.
Relationally, you were thinking.
Is it like lame to read my words to Pocahontas? Because for some reason your question makes me think about this thing that I'm not. Is that okay? It'll take 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking a lot about this, because I come to these territories as an artist, Indigenous artist in the tradition of Indigenous artists and the movement on the land, and these moments of exchange are affecting how I think. So this moment where we share together on the stage is something that is forever going to be a part of my body, and the ability to access it will change and not change. I was in. This feels strange, but so we went to London, England, and Dylan Robinson is a Stalo guy, Stalo person, supported me to go to London, England, and I did these interventions called cultural graffiti, where I marked sites around London with my voice and song and the performance of Tahltan Nation knowledge, which is also Indigenous power, right? And I was on a bus and I was on the train, and my friend Emer O'Toole was reading Edith Wharton, and I was unsure about whether or not to go to Pocahontas's grave site. And so what we did was we did something called Stokomancy, which we do at Bush Gallery a lot. And I said, Edith Wharton, Edith Wharton, Edith Wharton, should I go to visit Pocahontas? And then you kind of flip through the page, and then your finger lands on the answer, and then you have to interpret the answer. It's a very, one of the fortune-telling things. Well, anyway, Edith Wharton, I landed on no word of a lie, the word savage. So the answer meant, so the answer was I gotta go visit Pocahontas, right? And while I was there, so what you take forward with you, I take the knowledges and skills that my mother shared with me in the community of elders, old school elders that I was a part of, and had the privilege of knowing. So I take all of that to visit Pocahontas. But Pocahontas' land story is also one of all of our stories. So that's an interesting citation, I think. I'm old now, so I gotta take the glasses off. Yeah. Okay, so also I don't know more was happening here in these territories, and I wanted to offer energy to what was happening here. So part of the cultural graffiti actions were about offering and walking with the I Don't Know More movement that was happening here in this place now known as Canada. Sunday, singing to our Pocahontas, travel, finding you in a place called Gravesend, a strange name, I don't know you, but I feel at home calling you auntie, standing there by yourself with only dates and your name, auntie, I think you are a storm. I take a moment to clean your grave. This is what my mom taught me to do. You are standing there. I sing to you while I clean your grave, auntie. You are about to step into the sea, smudge, rocks, stones, smudge, the words, auntie, we love you. Auntie, we think of you often. Auntie, we speak of you often. Auntie, we are still here. Auntie, we remain. Auntie, don't worry, we are still alive. Auntie, we still make moccasins. Auntie, maybe one day you will come home. Auntie, your story is our story. Auntie, thank you for sharing your story with us. One song into the land, one song into your grave. One more song because I can't leave. One more song because I get worried no one visits you. One more song because I don't want to leave you here alone. Song, company. I leave some moose hide, then I notice that these grandmother spiders are taking care of you. And then the moose hide comes from an elder artist from our community called, her name is Penny Louie, and she wrote a book. We helped her publish a book about making hides. The book is called My Story of Making Hides by Penny Louie, a Casca Tahltan artist, residential school survivor. She wrote a book. And so the territory that I come from was eaten by this animal and carried with me to Pocahontas. And I put it by her bronze moccasins.
I feel like I agree with everything that's been said in terms of thinking citation's very important, and how every time I speak I feel like I need to cite the sentence I just said, you know? I say an idea. That idea came from this conversation I had with so-and-so at this point, and yeah, just realizing that, again, I don't own my thoughts, and I don't own what I'm saying. Like, they don't belong to me as a person, they belong to everyone, and these thoughts can exist in multiple different ways. I also think of citation through my practice. I also do cultural tattoos, hand poke and skin stitching, and a lot of the time when I'm marking other Indigenous folks, essentially what I'm doing is I'm marking this idea of home on them, and so I see that very much as a citation of themselves on their body. When I tattoo, I'm not really creating an image that I've drawn. I'm collaborating with the person getting a tattoo, so they'll oftentimes bring me an idea of what they want to symbolize on their bodies, or bring me images that already belong to their families. And then so through that idea of tattooing, a lot of the time I am doing that in very urban areas. And it will be the idea of me, a Michif person, tattooing a Dene person on Musqueam land, and how beautiful is that? And it just cites all of that, this large spectrum of knowledge and being. Mm-hmm.
It's nice. I'm glad you brought up citation, both with the S and the C, because clearly there is a politics of it. When I was starting writing, I felt like citation with a C was used as a weapon against us. Because if it wasn't written already in a book, thereby you couldn't cite it or wasn't taken as an appropriate citation. It was before, Canada had acknowledged that song and ceremony are legal declarations and forms of not only relationships to land, but also conceptions of justice. And now I see the tables have turned, which I think is extremely productive. But I also think it opens up these other possibilities for citation, what you just said, Audie, but also the way that I'm finding having to work, and that is in a space, especially when you're trying to write a history that hasn't necessarily been written in a certain way before. It's often done, fragments of it exist through conversations or interviews that anthropologists have had, particularly in my community in the Yukon, and through those fragments you can kind of read a subtext, or you hope to be able to read a subtext, but you also know that the interviewer is performing for them in a way as well, right? There's a performance there of trust or mistrust of what can be shared or not. So I was just telling Peter that after art school, when I was kind of unemployable, I did get an archivist position at Treaty 8 Tribal Association in Fort St. John, which was a remarkable job because it meant that I got to read all of the files and then create a kind of paragraph summing up what was in those documents. And those documents, that database was meant to be used by the community for more land claims. But what I tried to do in that too was to sort of listen to what was also not being said, right? Because a lot of times what comes forward in the written word isn't, as we know, isn't the entire story. So I wanted to share one thing that I haven't really shared publicly, and that was in the writing again of this era that I kind of imagine in my head. And this is an era of great rupture of when the gold rush happened in my community. I was writing about this encounter that I've heard of only a story before in my family, and that was that his name is Quiche, but he was often called in English Skookum Jim because of his size. And he was one of the two native co-discoverers of the gold rush. And he never said that sort of strike was his own luck. He always said that it was because prior he had been visited by a frog symbolizing wealth, and when he was visited by that frog, as far as I understand it, he thanked the frog for its visit. So when I started writing about it, I imagined him coming across this frog, and in my mind, it was a copper-sided frog. It was larger than normal, and it had these kind of gold specks on its side, and he could hear it actually croaking, and it was a bit stuck. It was stuck behind this deadfall. And when he went down to pick it up and to thank it for its visit and give it some goose down feathers and beads, when the frog turned to look at him, he was overwhelmed by this feeling of this incredible emptiness, because what he saw in the frog's eyes was the fact that it didn't have eyes at all. Its eyes instead were plates of gold. And this filled him with this incredible emptiness, and as I was writing this, I was thinking about it a lot, and I was going for lots of walks, and I was trying to imagine what life was like at that moment in his shoes. And then a few days later, I was reading some more documents, including this. It was a 172-page testimony by his nephew that was taken by some people who were working at the Skookum Jim Friendship Center that was established in the 70s. And the crazy thing was, of course, his nephew recalled the story that Skookum Jim had told him. And what Skookum Jim said is that the crazy thing about that frog is it had gold nuggets for eyes. So you think about the possibility of citation, right? And it's not always found in what exactly is written on the page, but also what's around it.
Yeah, I just feel like that's the right time to say thank you to everyone for all of these amazing collaborative and relational ideas that acknowledge all the work of your own ancestors and all our work here together, and the kind of amazing bubbles and spaces that they emerge, I think, when we have a chance to sit together like this. So just deeply thankful, Kuksjam, Limlimt. And we have more panels, more keynotes, more artists coming to visit, more opportunities to think together, and I'm grateful for that, and for all of your help in bringing us all here today and bringing out these knowledges. I think, like, you know, this space, we were able to share that. So thank you so much to also Toby and Meg for documenting, Toby for your work organizing, who you've all been in touch with, and Tracy as well, and to Stephen for his comments, and all of you who are participating in the classes. Thank you for being here. An incredible, thoughtful, and layered offering. So there's no other way to sort of close it than to have that visual, Candace. Of course, the gold rush was also very impactful for these territories. So I think that's a good place to leave us thinking through. So thank you.